I've seen some reporting suggesting that there's been some sort of breakthrough, some sort of agreement between the EU and the UK around WTO. What exactly has been agreed upon?
Well, we've come to an agreement on methodology of splitting EU quotas as we move forward, both with our technical rectification of schedules in Geneva, but also our EU free trade agreements, to which we are party at the present time. Sounds very confusing, because it is very confusing. It's not an agreement, but it's a good step forward. And I had discussed this issue with the European Trade Commissioner last week in Brussels. She and I get on very well together, and I think that we're taking a very constructive approach.
So what does this mean for the UK's trade relationship with the EU?
Nothing in particular, because it doesn't relate to our agreement with the EU on the end state and the future trade agreement. But as we leave the EU, we have to agree methods of dividing up the amount of quota that Britain should take from EU agreements, and we've agreed on methodology. So it is a step forward. I think it's also a sign that we can make progress when both sides choose to do so.
Okay, and on the subject of trade, we've heard from Michel Barnier and Jean-Claude Juncker today that they say not enough progress has been made to move on to talk about trade next week, or very soon. Is the UK taking anything new to the table next week to the negotiations?
We've already taken things to the table, and we think it's time to move on to the second stage.
But if they say not yet, are we taking anything new next week?
I've been talking to businesses as well as politicians in Europe, and also crucially to investors outside Europe. And there is pressure now that says, we don't have to put our money in Europe, and we would like to know what our Italian and German and French investments will mean in terms of access to the UK market. And I would just caution some of those involved that investors don't have to put their money in Europe. And if it becomes unclear what the access to the respective markets will be, they may decide to go elsewhere. And this is part of the problem. I think that those you mentioned need to understand that we're not conducting this negotiation in a political or economic vacuum. We're doing it in the context of a very competitive global economy.
But as it's the UK's decision to leave the EU, Theresa May called in Florence for creativity. Isn't it up to the UK to bring more creativity to the table if those in Brussels say we haven't got far enough
Well,
yet?
We've been making the offers, and you say Britain's decision, but it's our decision as a right under the Lisbon Treaty. It's not as though Britain's breaking away or doing something against the rules. We were doing something that had been pre-agreed that we had a right to do. And that agreement itself says that the European Union must give due consideration to the future relationship. We now think it's time for them to honour that part of Article 50.
I was interested in some of the comments that Philip Hammond made today. He was talking to business groups and saying perhaps business needs to do more to persuade some members in the Cabinet about the need for transition. Are you one of those members of the Cabinet who's not persuaded of the need for a transition or implementation deal as yet?
We only know what transition can be when we know what the end state is. Unless you know what you're transiting to, it's very hard to say what that will look like. I'm very, very keen that we get to that second stage. It's the most important part of our negotiation with the EU. It's all about whether we will introduce impediments to trade and investment in Europe that don't exist today. If that happens for reasons of political ideology on the other side of the channel, that would be very unfortunate, because it would be disruptive to Europe as a whole. And I want us to put the prosperity of the citizens of Europe, the trade and the competitiveness of Europe as our priority, not politics.
So that has to come first before conversations about any kind of transition or implementation, do you think?
Well, until we know what we're transitioning to, it's very hard to say what the transition would be. I have no problems with transition. We're leaving the European Union and the single market and the customs union in March 2019. If we want to operate parallel agreements and rules to make sure there's no disruption to our business, that is fine. I don't have an objection to that. But I want to know what the end state is going to be. and it can't be left as a vague never, never.
Can I also ask you about Bombardier? There's a lot of moving parts in this story, of course, and the tariffs imposed on Bombardier as a result of the United States actions. Does this give us any bad feeling about the potential for a trade deal between the UK and the United States, given how the UK is being treated in this particular matter?
No, I think it's unrelated. This is a dispute between Boeing and Bombardier, two big aircraft manufacturers. It reads across to some of the NAFTA discussions at the present time, dispute resolution inside the NAFTA agreement. We are being affected really by the crossfire in that. I still hope that we can get Boeing and Bombardier to come to some agreement. If that doesn't happen, it's still got some way to go even inside the American system before it would go to dispute resolution at NAFTA or even at the WTO. A long way to go. I've just spoken this evening to Wilbur Ross in the United States about it, as I encouraged Gary Cohn, the economic advisor to the president last week, to try and let's use our good offices to try to bring the players closer together and see if we can get a settlement that doesn't leave it sitting in the full glare of public opinion.
Did Wilbur Ross suggest that there'd be movement?
Well, obviously I'm not going to discuss what our conversations were, but we're very clear that we want to try to get resolution of this as quickly as we can.